You're listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS. Whether it's for food, fuel, drinks, or snacks, about half of the U.S. population shops at a convenience store every day. We'll talk about what we see at stores and what the future may hold for our industry.
Disasters can strike anywhere, anytime, and that's of particular interest to convenience stores because they are everywhere and they're open around the clock. I think a lot of retailers know what to do when a disaster strikes and what the checklist is to prepare for the store. But what about at the pump, and what about under the pump? That's what we're going to spend some time talking about today. Welcome to Convenience Matters. My name is Jeff Lenard with NACS.
And I'm Carolyn Schnare with NACS.
And today we're talking to Mark Barolo. He's with the EPA. Specifically, he's the Deputy Office Director, Office of Underground Storage Tanks, Office of Land and Emergency Management. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So when we talk about underground storage tanks, that's what we're talking about with some of the things that disasters relate to. But more broadly, underground storage tanks are critical for everyday operations under normal circumstances. And we're very appreciative of the work that EPA does. They're great partners in how our industry that sells 80% of the gas continues to do it in a thoughtful, safe way for the store, for the community in general. And there's new regulations that have recently been released. Can you talk a little bit about how they apply to fuel retailers?
Sure. So in 2015, EPA came out with a new set of requirements, and the primary focus of the requirements was to make sure that the existing equipment functioned properly. The original regulations that came from EPA were in 1988, and it was really focused on making sure the systems had the right equipment to prevent and detect releases. They weren't as good as making sure that it functioned properly. And so many years later, the equipment wore out, wasn't regularly checked. And so the new set of requirements is really focused on making sure that what you have in place continues to work.
And technology continues to advance with underground storage tanks. I remember when I lived in New York, every now and then there'd be a water main break, or quite often there would be. But every now and then they'd cut out a section and they'd say, this is wood, or something crazy where it's 100 years old and the system's still in place. But when we're not talking about wood with underground storage tanks. We're talking about very sophisticated, very up-to-date equipment. But it's also important that what we know today is still true for tomorrow, so that everything goes very smoothly at a station, because it's also it tamps down business when tanks need to be replaced, when all these concrete needs to be cracked,
or if they leak.
Yes, permitting, all of those issues. So underground storage tanks, really, they are critical for how we continue to sell fuel, and we continue to get customers inside the store who are buying fuel and also going inside. Talk a little bit about what retailers might want to specifically pay attention to with these regs.
Sure. So the first thing to think about is when do they come into play? And so the way the program is implemented is primarily with the state programs being the direct implementing agencies. So EPA sets some broad regulations and broad support and guidance, but a lot of the day-to-day implementation is at the state level. And so when the requirements take place and exactly what those requirements will be for a given facility will depend on the state that they're in. We have information on our website, try to help guide people to the right states and give a sense of when are the requirements coming into effect in the different states. So that's one key, is to know what specifically is required in your jurisdiction, and when is that requirement going to kick in. For much of the country, or a good chunk of the country, a lot of the requirements were effective last in the fall of 2018. And they will phase in other states through the fall of 2021. So depending where you're located, the date will be different. But from a technology standpoint, you're right that there's always evolving and improving technology. One interesting thing about this program is systems tend to stay in the ground a long time. I think approximately half the systems in the ground today are more than 25 years old. So that's a lot of freeze and thaw cycles depending where you're located. They're often in high traffic areas, driving over them. So there's a lot happens to these systems underground, and you really can't see them. So checking to make sure they continue to be in proper condition and that the prevention detection equipment will continue to operate is critical. It's, as you said, it's a critical part of the business for a convenience store. Often the land is a critical part of their family investment and their income, and it's not in anyone's best interest to have a release. And so you started about partnerships, and it really has been a program with great partnerships from the beginning of the program back in the 80s between the various levels of regulators, the tank owning community, the servicing community, and the equipment industry. And there's a lot of great collaboration and coordination, and there's a sort of a common goal of making sure that there are not releases and the associated ramifications.
So, and as our retailers that listen, I know you mentioned that there's a lot of information on your website, and I know our team that works directly with the retailers when they do have specific questions, think that EPA has some amazing resources, a great partner for us, and all the stuff we've been able to point our retailers towards. Is there, so they just go to the EPA website, is there a specific area they can look for help?
Yep, good question. There's a specific section for underground storage tanks. So the simple way to get there is epa.gov/UST.
Very easy to remember.
Tank. And that will get you to the homepage of our office, and from there, there's information about the regulatory requirements, contact information for your local state agencies, the different technologies. There are questions and answers about regulatory interpretations. There's information about the cleanup side of the program. So there are a lot of good resources.
For a website with a / in it and be 9 letters is astonishing. So
it's changed over time. Right?
Might have set the record, particularly with a governmental entity, which normally there's a number of levels and backslashes.
And
so
if we send them to convenience, I mean, I can barely spell it on a daily basis, and it's where I work, so it's much easier than spelling convenience.
Yeah, sometimes fingers don't work properly, but that's super convenient. Now, is there any geographic rollout in terms of areas that are affected by the regulations? Does it start in one area of the country, or is there some path where even before they go to the website, somebody might go, oh, I might be a little later on in the list because it's this?
Not specifically sort of geographically. It's really state dependent. We have a concept called state program approval. And there are about 40 states and territories with what we call state program approval, which means the state's regulations operate in lieu of the federal regulations because we've determined that they're no less stringent. In those areas, a tank owner really doesn't focus on the federal requirements because it's the state requirements that apply exclusively. In the other 16 states, and on our website we have a map about where those are, in those other 16 states, both the state and the federal regulations apply in parallel. So if we're sort of a rough cut at it, states without program approval, all these regulatory deadlines took place in fall of 2018. And that has to do with testing your equipment in various ways, testing the spill bucket around the delivery pipe, testing the containment sumps around the pump, testing the under dispenser containment under certain circumstances, doing a monthly walkthrough and doing sort of a visual check to make sure that there's nothing that's sort of obviously a problem. So tank owners are probably familiar, or many would be familiar with whether they're in a state that has program approval or not. So if they don't have program approval, the deadline has already passed.
And you better get to work on that. So I'm going to pivot a little bit towards something that we talked about in the beginning, which is fortifying your business against a disaster. So disasters are a little different these days. I mean, we've got more flooding than we've ever seen before in different parts of the country that aren't really used to it. So I know that can wreak havoc on tanks, on everything actually. But I would imagine especially tanks, especially when like in the Washington, D.C. area where we live, we've got record rainfall in the last year than we had 71 inches of rain or something. Where does that go? It goes in the ground. So is there any resources or thought in your department about preparing for how a retailer can prepare for this, or how even, whether regulations or systems change or anything as the weather changes?
Absolutely. It's been a big issue in the program for many years, but as you say, it seems to have been even more common recently. Flooding can come from hurricanes. They can come from just rain events. They can come from rivers overflowing, and we're seeing a lot of that on a regular basis now, unfortunately. An underground storage tank acts like a bubble. And imagine being in a pool and holding a floating ball underwater. It wants to come up to the surface. So the biggest challenge with underground storage tanks is when there's a flooding scenario, the tank wants to rise up to the top of that water level. There are plenty of scenarios where tanks have popped all the way out of the ground. There's other scenarios where they will just move just enough that it's not visible from the surface, but it's enough to crack the tank, or even more likely crack the piping that's associated with it. So when operation starts again, you now have a system without integrity, and you're pumping to sell the fuel, but it's actually, some of it's actually getting out into the groundwater. Mm-hmm. So floating this system is a big issue. So there are a number of things that can be done before a flood, and there are a number of steps that should be taken after a flood. For example, you want as much weight as you can to hold that system in place. So when possible, fill the tank as much as reasonable. Can be hard to do, especially in a hurricane evacuation route where everyone's trying to fill up with their own vehicles to get out. But to the extent that you can, fill up your tank as much so there's less airspace at the top of the tank. It's less likely to try to float out of the ground. There are a lot of access points on the ground surface that you want to make sure are especially tight, because if water seeps into the system, the fuel floats on the water, and so you're basically displacing the fuel, and the water's going to get into their system. The fuel is all they're going to come out of your system, and that creates a mess, and among other things. So there are ways to tighten all the points on the top of the system. For example, the dispenser has a safety feature, a shear valve, where in case someone drives into your dispenser, you don't have a geyser of fuel coming out.
Oh.
There's a
only in the
pop-in.
movies.
Right. But as it's supposed to work, if that happens, the valve is supposed to shut off, and it'll shut off the gasoline coming out. But as you're leaving a facility, you would want to manually trip that. And so that's an access point that the water then no longer can get in.
Yeah, I think if Hollywood got word that existed, half of the action movies in the country would never be made, because there's always some hero flying through the air because of some explosion, and we know that's not the case. Now, when we talk about, to a certain extent, it's counterintuitive to most people when you think like, okay, I'm concerned about the underground storage tank. I should probably have as little in it as possible, but the most is the better action plan.
Well, is that across the board? Is that every situation? Like you're like facing a drought. Do you want it full?
Okay, so a drought is not going to cause a problem to an underground storage tank system. Creates other
true.
problems. It's really what I'm talking about. Really, is a flooding event. Mm-hmm. And of all the natural disasters, any that involves flooding is the biggest risk to your tank system. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of things. We see tornadoes and other things that affect the canopy in the building. Less likely to impact the storage tank, but any kind of flooding event is what's going to cause the biggest concern with the underground storage tank. So EPA actually has developed an underground storage tank guide for flooding, and it's up on our website, one of the many documents. And I know that we'd had a conversation that NACS has working on documents that are also going to be helpful for natural disasters more generally. The one on our website is focused specifically for underground storage tanks. Has some information on what to do beforehand, has information on what to do afterwards, how to safely get back into operation. Everyone wants to get back into operation as soon as they can for a lot of reasons, but if it's not done correctly, you can actually exacerbate the problem and make it even worse than it already was with the flooding. Has a lot of connections to materials that states have developed. States have been through this. A lot of them have developed specific requirements and guidance documents. And so in many states, there are things that you actually have to do before you can come back online. For example, tightness test of your tank, tightness test of your piping to make sure that there hasn't been a cracking in any of that. So once you start pumping fuel again, you're not just putting the fuel out into the environment.
Is there any broad recommendation for when you should think about things related to the underground storage tanks and flooding? A rain of more than 3 inches, a location near a body of water that might flood, any sort of general guidance when people should be on a higher alert for what might happen at their underground storage tank?
So typically there's some advanced warning before a flooding event. We all hear notices about flood risks. Obviously, if there's talk of a hurricane coming through, you will know if you're located near a river. They'll be talking about risk of the river overflowing, and so there's often is some advance warning. Fortunately,
advance being
flooding.
like a few hours,
a few hours, or even, or
maybe even a few days.
Right?
Yeah.
And so you can start to prepare for it and get ready for it. Again, easier to do for a non-retail facility than it is for a retail facility who's sort of operating right up until the last minute as much as possible, because people need the fuel for their vehicles. So it's not so much how much rain, it's where you're located relative to a floodplain, relative to a coast if it's a hurricane scenario.
Well, you make a great point, because as you mentioned, we've released a guide for emergency preparedness, but that's just something you need to write into your plans, write into your training plans for employees, for managers, for everybody to plan and prepare for whether it's expected, unexpected, in terms of just knowing exactly the roles, the responsibilities, who does what and when, and accessibility to those emergency plans, and as clear and concise and easy to read as they can be, so that should the situation arise with only a few hours notice. I mean, a few hours goes really quickly when there's something very dangerous coming your way, especially when you have to prepare for not only your business or your employer's business or the operation you work at, but you're worried about your family and everybody else at home. And then you got to worry about getting back there. So there's all of those things to take into account. And so that's where NACS has resources, not as easy a website to type in, but convenience.org/disaster. So make sure you get a chance to check those out, but make those plans and include those with from EPA and the tank situations, excuse me.
Yeah, and I also, one thing when we talked about earlier, we talked about what happens, a bubble, and possibly these underground storage tanks can come up and things like that. I think in our industry, we know that we talk about all of these precautions and all these safeguards because we want to make sure that nothing unusual, that's a routine as possible. So for anyone outside of the industry, no reason to panic. These are all safeguards that are in place to ensure that the routine happens as often as possible. And that's why we work with EPA on this.
Right. Absolutely.
So looking down the road a little bit, I know there's we talked about it earlier on different fuels, different types of technologies coming down the road. Are there some things that retailers or that EPA is looking at that retailers should think about in terms of different fuels, different blends, different types of things coming down the pike?
So that's a great question. Fuels are constantly changing. Anyone who's been in the business for a long time has seen the evolution of a fuel. Even if it's straight gasoline, that's different than it was 5, 10, 20 years ago. Same thing with diesel. And every fuel is a different chemical that has different chemical reactions with the equipment that it's stored in and when there's a release and how you assess and clean up the release. It's not that it's all good or bad, they're just all different. And it's really critical to consider that when deciding what fuel to sell. There's been a big movement towards more ethanol in the fuels, and to the extent that a marketer chooses to sell higher blends of ethanol, 15%, 85%, for example, compatibility with the system is a critical part of the thought process they have to go to. A new system today can be purchased to be fully compatible with high blends of ethanol. That's not an issue or problem, but it's the conversion of an existing system into higher blends of ethanol where we run into issues. Unless a system was spec'd at the time of installation specifically for higher blends of ethanol, there are going to be certain aspects of that system that are simply not compatible with the higher blends of ethanol. Tank may be okay, the piping may be okay, but there are a lot of other pieces. In the pumping system, anytime there's a gasket or a seal, those are designed for a specific chemical. Different gaskets and seals work better for different products. And so if you put in a system with the expectation of not having ethanol fuel, that system is not going to be fully ready. So it's just something to consider from a business standpoint. It's something to consider from a risk standpoint. And it also is actually something to consider from a regulatory standpoint. If you're going to sell higher than 10% ethanol, the the federal underground storage tank regulation requires notification of the state agency ahead of time, and it requires demonstration of compatibility of the various components, just to avoid the scenario where the simple matter of changing the fuel leads to a breakdown of a critical component in that system, and then that can cause a release.
So it's basically as you look at new fuels and what new fuels might the customer base support, and then how do you market it? There's a whole separate phase that retailers need to spend some time on, is how do I do this, and how do I do it with either equipment I have or move to the new equipment? And it's just part of that process. Just put some thought into what needs to happen below the ground, and also, of course, with the dispensers.
Sure, exactly.
So you've been working with underground storage tanks for years. I assume that anytime you fill up, you look at gas stations differently. And if you're like anybody else in our industry, probably drives friends and family nuts because you pause. It's like, hey, I want to look at this. How do you look at gas stations and fuel retailers when you go in now? Do you look at certain things and not to single out somebody who's doing something that isn't up to code or something like that, but are you ever surprised and go, wow, that's a really slick operation?
So that's an interesting question. It is certainly something I look for, and most people will drive up and they'll drive over the covers, but they won't know what they mean. And now, if you know what you're looking for, you can actually see how the systems are aligned at a facility, and you can see the directions of the tanks and where they are, and does it look like that's a compartmentalized tank or a non-compartmentalized tank? Interesting thing about us systems, though, is you really can't see much, and that's part of the challenge of owning and operating. It's part of the challenge of regulating, because it is hard to really see what's going on. Oftentimes, a delivery is a point where I'll have a particular interest and watch the delivery to see if the delivery is being handled properly, because that's something that you can actually see. What's underground, or you don't know what type of system it is. There's been sort of a movement over the years to secondary containment, which is a terrific idea and is actually a requirement for any new system going in the ground. So that's basically a tank within a tank or a pipe within a pipe, and the monitoring is of the space in between. So if there is a problem, either with the outer wall or with the inner wall, you can detect that problem before it's a release into the environment, which is a problem for multiple reasons. But you can't actually see that when you're on the ground. So it is something I look for. I wonder a lot. It creates questions for me. But
they're like, why is this guy just getting gas, just wandering around my parking lot? Let's find out what's he doing out there.
Right. Is he staying close to his delivery truck? Is he smoking near the
Whenever Jeff and I go on any road trips or we're in there, we're wandering around stores. Unless it's someone we're there to visit specifically, we're looking around, we're like, oh, look at that cooler. My family's like, come on, let's
Taking
go. Let's go.
And then we all have to go inside and let's have a trivia question about what the different caps are for the underground storage. What fuel goes in there?
Right.
Also noticed one of the other trends is people are sometimes piping and moving the underground storage tank away from underneath the canopy. And I've seen that done and explained for a couple of reasons. One is makes it a little easier for more customers to go in when the truck's a little to the side. Sometimes various customers feel they want a little bit more room. And if the truck's not there, if it's 100 extra feet of piping, that gives them a little bit more latitude. I was at a store a couple weeks ago, and they said, yeah, we moved them to the side, and we put them on the sidewalk because we get a lot of snow, and those snow plows.
Great idea.
So there's various other when you
there's
look
a lot
at
to
stores.
Consider. A lot to consider when designing it. The stores are around for a long time, so there's not always an opportunity to redesign. But for those who are starting a new store altogether, it's absolutely something to consider. The location of the systems can have a big impact on the likelihood of a problem and the ease of compliance for the next multiple decades while that system is there. And you mentioned going up on a sidewalk to avoid the plows, locating it in a place where the flow of the rainwater is not rushing over those caps, because keeping water out of that system is critical, and it's hard to do where the water is constantly flowing over. So if it's at a higher part of the location, you're not going to have the water through. So there are a lot of things to consider in the design of a system as well, and that can just make it easier to operate and maintain. Going out and testing systems, that you're often right in sort of the dangerous part where the vehicles are driving. If you have the caps off and you're working in there, but if it's off to the side, if there's space at that facility, that's a great option. So something to consider for new facilities going in.
And on a lot of our other episodes, we've talked about electricity, and I know that's nothing we're going to talk about because that's a whole nother hour or two show of piping electricity and for EVs and electrical vehicles getting stations. So you're always learning something new.
Yeah, and it's always best to make those decisions when you can see them before you start putting them under concrete and have to crack it to modify it. Thank you very much, Mark. And once again, the website where they can find out more about how to find out the best information on USTs.
It's epa.gov/UST.
Thanks again, Mark.
And thank you for listening to Convenience Matters.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in partnership with Human Factor. For more information, visit convenience.org.